Now, for those of you who are privileged to be parents, do you remember what it was like as you prepared for the birth of your first child? You know, you get ready, and I remember, Sandy told me, okay, we have to do this. We have to go to Lamaze class because she had decided we're going to go with natural childbirth. And so we go for 6 weeks and learn all the breathing exercises and pain management. And we're all down. We're all ready for this. But I don't know about you. Now, in my experience, here's how it worked. Is we went for 6 weeks. We're totally committed to it because she has a deep conviction for natural childbirth. And we have the labor pains. And about a half hour in, the conviction totally changed, and she had a really deep conviction for the value of epidurals. And I'm like, I wasted all that time. It's okay. Well, I know the breathing exercises. And then we get ready and we go to the ultrasound. And so we're there at the ultrasound, and this technician's going over, and looking at the screen and saying, here's the legs and here's the arm, and boy, I'm sitting there. To admit it, it all looks like a moving blob to me, and but I don't want to admit that because men never admit that they don't get what's going on. So I said, oh yeah, I see that, and so then I go and I think that I'm going to really try to be good, and it says, oh look here, it looks like she's really developing a round face, and the technician looks at me and says, that's her rear end. I'm like, okay, I don't get it, and then finally she comes. And, we're there, and the big day's there, and you see the miracle of childbirth, and the doctor hands me this little child, and I remember thinking at that moment, I'm responsible for this child. I'm the one that's responsible now to raise her and to provide for her and to love her and to teach her to be a godly woman. And I don't have a clue how to do that. And I remember looking at the doctor, and he just takes the baby out. And I'm looking, now, is anything else coming there? Is there an instruction manual? Is there something to tell me how to do this? Because the fact is that you think you're prepared, and suddenly you realize you're not. And how do you do this? And then as you start to figure it out, and then they grow to another stage, and it's a whole new challenge. And then you have another one, and you think you've got it figured out from the first one, and you realize that the second one is nothing at all like the first one, and whatever worked with the first one doesn't work at all with the second one. And so now I'm even more confused. And so you look at all this, and you say, what in the world can we do? Each child is unique. They don't come with this instruction manual. But you know what? While they don't come with a personalized instruction manual, there is a sense that their manufacturer, their creator, did send us a set of generalized instructions. It just didn't come with the package. And there are people that will say that when the Bible speaks about parenting, well, that was a different time and a different culture, and it's out of date. And what we need to realize is that no, that God is still the creator. He's still the manufacturer. And yes, times have changed, but human nature has not changed, and God's truth has not changed. And the principles that God said about parenting are just as true today as they were when he first said them. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to dive into Colossians, and we're going to see some of the ideas that God gives us here in the book of Colossians about parenting. But as we do, what I want to point out first of all is something that is, I think, very important and very, very easy to miss. And that is that the passage we're looking at, the main passage, Colossians 3:20 and 21, Paul is directly speaking to children, obey your parents. Parents, don't embitter your children. Direct advice about parenting. But what we have to realize is that what he says in verses 20 and 21 build on what he's already just said now in verses 18 and 19, where he's talked about marriage. In fact, it's not only here. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul talks about marriage, and he gives instructions about marriage. And then he goes in Ephesians 6 about parenting. And he does the same thing, and what he's teaching us is this. Something that I think is out throughout the Bible, he's modeling here, is that God's instructions on parenting build on his instructions for marriage. Now, I'm going to take a moment and realize and acknowledge that I'm going to talk about something here that I believe is God's ideal plan for the family. The ideal plan is that it's a husband and wife who make a lifetime commitment, and then in that commitment raise their children. And I say that knowing that there are many here who are not experiencing that ideal. That's not your reality. For one reason or another, you're struggling to be a parent alone, or your marriage is broken apart. And part of me is really tempted to not risk offending anybody or causing any discomfort, and therefore to avoid this issue, But in doing so, to kind of risk, because I don't want to cause discomfort, to avoid talking about God's ideal plan and what I think is being taught here in Scripture. The fact is that if you're a single parent, you know that what you're experiencing isn't the ideal. You know that the fact is it's hard. And the goal isn't to beat anybody up on that. You know it's hard. And you know it'd be a whole lot easier if you had the ideal. And so when I speak about this, the goal isn't to beat anybody up. It isn't to discourage you. I want to encourage you in the midst of this that what you need to do is seek out God's grace. But on the other hand, I still need to talk about what the God's word is, what his ideal is here. And the fact is that when we look at God's ideal plan for the family, again, you see him first of all saying, start with the marriage, then talk about parenting. Because God has designed the family around the marriage as the center, not as around the children. Now this is, again, contrary to the world's wisdom of our time. The world's wisdom, and even often hear this being taught in churches, which I think is based more on the world's wisdom than biblical wisdom, is that if you're a really loving parent, you're going to sacrifice everything that you have for your kids. Your kids come first, you put them first in all things, and you sacrifice everything. So much so that now you hear all the time. You hear, for example, moms that will brag about how they give everything for the kids, and they drive everywhere, and my job is my mom's taxi, or my kid's taxi, and I'm doing this and doing this, and boy, I haven't had time, we haven't had a dinner together, I haven't seen my husband, and we always brag about that because we're saying, well, look at what a great parent I am, because I'm sacrificing everything for my children. But now let me ask you a question. What are we teaching our children when we do that? What we're teaching them by our action is that basically we see you as the center of the universe, and we're going to sacrifice everything for that, and we're teaching you, and you should expect to be the center of the universe, not only in your family, but when you grow older. And you should expect people to serve you. Is that true? No, it's not. So not only they're not the center of the universe, they're not the center of the family. In Genesis 2, where God initiates the whole idea of family, look what he says. Genesis 2. The idea here is that, the greatest gift you can give your children is a healthy marriage. I want to show you this. Again, look at Genesis chapter 2, 2:24. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And what does it say here? What's the core of the family? It's not the child. It's not the parent-child relationship, because one day the child leaves the family. They leave the family and are joined to their spouse. That's not something that is meant to last. It's the marriage relationship that's the one that's meant to last. That's the one that until death do us part that is meant to last. That's the highest priority. And that's why we say that the greatest gift you can give your children is a healthy marriage. Do you want to be a great parent? If you want to be a great parent, then the greatest gift that you can give is a strong marriage relationship with your spouse. It means taking time to say no to them. To say no to the things that they want to do, to the attention that they want to receive, and say, I'm not going to spend time with you now because I'm going to set aside time to focus on my marriage, on my husband or my wife. Now, this is totally countercultural because we think that as parents, we want to be selfless and we want to give everything to our kids, and we want to give them all these things, and we never want to exclude them. We want to give them the message that they're always important, they're always significant. See, but what we need to realize is that when we lift up the centrality of marriage, what we're doing is that we're giving them a gift of security, of telling them that now as you grow up, the foundation in what you grow up on, the family and the relationship between mommy and daddy, that's secure because we're committed to this. And nothing is going to threaten that. See, there's a sense where our kids are hardwired to be selfish, to demand. And part of that demanding demanding of time is even, in a sense, testing our marriage. They're going to try to get between us. And they're going to try to climb in bed with us. And they're going to throw a fit when they want time. And part of it is saying, am I the center? And can I get in between the marriage? See, am I the center of the universe? And how tight is the relationship between mom and dad? How secure or insecure should I be? Can I trust that mom and daddy are going to stay together and love each other? Let me give you a practical example story about this. This was something, when we were young, someone really challenged on this. So we had our one child, Tiffany, was our oldest. She was probably a year old. And somebody really challenged us that you've got to put the marriage first. And at times that means spend time together. And if she tries to get between you, you say, no, this is mommy and daddy time. And you don't let her get between you. And so we're sitting there on the couch, and she comes and tries to climb up in her lap. And we said, no, Tiffany, this is mommy and daddy time. And this is just for time for mommy and daddy. So she continues to climb up. So we start, Sandy and I we start hugging each other and just saying, okay, we're not going to let her get between us. She's trying to get between us. And she continued to try to squirm between us, so much so that we rolled off the sofa. We're on the floor, hugging each other. And she, she's trying to get between us. Finally, she can't. So we're laying on the floor. So she gets up and she walks around and she plops her diaper right in my face. And it's kind of her way of saying, if I don't get daddy, nobody's getting daddy. Now, somebody would say, now that's not loving, because you got to let her know that she's always included and she's always loved and she's always there for her. You know what? She knows that she's loved. And she knows that we communicate that a whole lot. But you know what we needed to communicate at that moment, and we need to communicate many other times, is that she would know that I also love her mommy. And her mommy's a priority. And the fact is, there are going to be times I say no to her because I'm saying yes to my marriage. And what that teaches her is that life is secure. It's an incredible priority. It's teaching that she's not the center, that she has been invited to come into this family, and she is a loved part of it, but she's not the center of it. The center of it is that mommy and daddy made a lifetime commitment, and we are going to be together even after she leaves the home. We need to communicate that. And that means making a priority to spend time with our spouse and letting our kids see that time. It means that once we've decided to do that, that we protect that. And even when something comes up, our kids, we need to do this. It's okay to say no. It's okay if they don't go to that party or that game. It's okay to say, no, this is more important. That's a wonderful message to send to them. Now, if something, real emergency happens and it's a matter of life or death, well, maybe you can postpone that date. But anything other than that, it's great to be able to tell them that, no, God has put us together, that gives them security. Now, building on that first principle, now let's go, and he said, what specific principle does he give to us as parents? And I think these are true as grandparents as well. Verse 20, he says this, he's seemingly addressing children. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Now, while he addresses the children here, it's important to note that there's an assumed command to the parents, because Paul is assuming that parents will take seriously the responsibility to provide instruction and discipline to their children. And so again, you're not going to say obey your parents if parents aren't demanding that. Now, I'd say in many cultures and many times this is something that you're saying, oh, that's a no-brainer. Yeah, parents are supposed to discipline and instruct their children, but unfortunately, we've kind of lost a little bit of that in 21st century America, where increasingly it seems that parents don't always discipline, don't always instruct. In fact, it's often taught specifically, well, don't do that. What you need to do is you need to empower kids. You need to let them have self-expression and let them express who they are and find their own identity. We hear that all the time. In fact, what you hear is, well, we need to be our children's friend. Not their parent. We're trying to be their friend. And as a result, it's not uncommon where you go out and you see a preschooler that's controlling their family, controlling their parents. They're throwing a fit and demanding things. The next thing you know, it's basically mom and dad are doing whatever little junior is calling for, because we're not in control. Now, I know again that a lot of what I'm going to say goes against conventional wisdom. It is going to be even seen as offensive by multiple people. But let me even give a little bit of a backdrop. See, when we look at this, what we've got to realize is that a lot of the world's view of parenting comes from a non-biblical worldview about a child and their moral structure and who they are. You see, the world's system is kind of, children are born morally neutral, or they're innately good. And because they're innately good or morally neutral, then what we need to do as parents is we need to teach them to express themselves and to discover their inner desire within them and help them go with their natural tendencies. So that what do? We promote self-esteem. Not based on anything that they've done, but we just tell them that they're wonderful and that they should feel good about themselves. And we talk about concepts like self-actualization, or self-actualization, break away from the boundaries of expectation and help them to discover their own truth. We don't talk about commandments. So in schools, we wouldn't ever talk about things like the 10 Commandments in schools and expectation. And then we're surprised when we don't teach them that the Bible says, thou shalt not murder, when they bring guns into schools and kill each other. We've got a problem. You see, the Bible teaches that we're not born morally good. It teaches that we're all born with a natural sin nature. In Psalm 51. Nope. Sorry about that. Let's go back in my thing here. Psalm 51. It says this. Here we go. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Our children are born with a sin nature. We all are. We're born with this natural sin nature. So that, again, when you look at your children, I never had to teach them how to say no. I never had to teach them how to rebel. I never had to teach them how to throw a fit. That came naturally. There's a sin nature, and therefore we have to teach them by teaching them what is right and wrong. Disciplining them, helping them see consequences, giving them the ability to be able to fight against that nature, to learn. So that's why Proverbs 22 says this, folly is bound up in the heart of the child. That's the natural tendency, is that they will do the wrong things. The natural tendency isn't that we're good, the natural tendency is that we're bad. And so the natural tendency is that we have folly in the heart of the child, but the rod of discipline drives him far from it. So there's an importance of discipline. There's an importance of teaching truth. The writer of Hebrews says this, for what son is there who his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which you have all participated, then you are illegitimate children, not sons. And then he goes on and he says, that's why God disciplines us. And so what he's saying is that an evidence of being a child of God is God's discipline. And so many people, if you're here and you just feel like life's going bad, and it's possible that God's pursuing you. And he's saying, no, you're making decisions, and I want to correct you, and I'm going to make your life unpleasant because I want to bring you to a relationship with me. See, that may be God's love. And for those of us who have a relationship with Christ, we know that that's what God does. And what it means is that the absence of discipline, if God shows his love towards disciplining us, the absence of discipline is not an act of love, but it's an act that we do not love. It's a lack of commitment to our children. Now, I want to acknowledge, my natural tendency is that I'm not a natural disciplinarian. I naturally will err on the side of being too soft. And people I know early on, would say, well, you're so loving, you're going to struggle with this. And I would like to think it's because I love my kids so much, it's so hard for me to discipline. But you know what God's taught me? God's taught me, and he's convicted me of the fact that when I fail to properly discipline my children, it's not because I love them too much, it's because I'm too selfish. My lack of discipline is always rooted in my selfishness. Because discipline is one of the most difficult things that I ever do as a parent. When we don't discipline, the reason I don't is because it's too difficult. It's too difficult and it's too painful for me to go through. So therefore, I don't do what I believe is right because I'm selfish. That's what I struggle with. It's too difficult because I haven't put thought to it. I haven't really thought through, what is this issue? I haven't put the mental energy and preparation to think through. I don't want to deal with the consequences of enforcing the discipline. I know my kids are going to rebel against it, and it's going to be difficult, and they're grounded, then they've got to just sit around, and they're going to complain all the time, and I don't want to go through that. So I don't. I don't want to risk the relationship with the child. So if I discipline them, they might be mad at me, and out of selfishness, I don't want to risk that. But it's my selfishness. Often for me, it's painful to administer. And so if I discipline them, I see them in pain or discomfort, and it hurts me. And because it hurts me and because it's painful for me, out of my selfishness, I don't do it because I'm not willing to go through the pain with my child to ultimately see their growth. See, God's convicted me of that, and that's one of the things that I continue to fight against. So that when I want to be soft, when I want to give in, and when I want to, not do the whole thing, but I've got to go all the way with discipline. What I need to realize is that no, God is calling me to do this as an act of selfless love, even though it seems to be so difficult, and so at times it might feel unloving. It's driven by love. Now, that's the first thing that he says to us as parents. Now let me go to children. If there are any, we don't have as many children in this service, but there are some. Let's look what he says to children. And we need to, as parents, understand we need to teach what God says to our children. Verse 20, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. So he now calls children, and here's what he tells children. He teaches us how to respond to discipline. So when your parents try to discipline you, this is how you're to respond. Now the word that he uses here for children is the word tekna, and it describes children who will be living at home. And most people agree that what Paul is saying here is it applies to children who are still living under their parents' roof and still financially dependent upon them. So it's not just for young children. Sometimes you'll have people say, well, that's what God says to grade schoolers or preschoolers, but I'm a teenager and I'm not really a child anymore. The Bible said when you were 13, you were an adult, and I've heard those things. When he talks about this, it talks about dependence. If you're on your own and paying your own bills and independent, well, then you're no longer under this command as a child. If you are still under dependency of your parents, living at their home, if they're still paying the bills, then this applies to you. Now, as parents, we teach them to be more independent. But what you've got to realize as a child, this applies to you. Second of all, when we look at this, it's important to notice that he doesn't give the same command here as he gives to wives. We saw a couple weeks ago when he says to wives, submit to your husbands. He doesn't call children to submit to their parents. We saw a couple weeks ago that submission is a voluntary choice made by an equal party. To obey is something very different. Children are not equal to their parents. Are they equal as far as value and worth? Yes. But they're not equal as far as experience. They're not equal as far as wisdom. And before God, they're not equal in structure. God says, no, I've given authority to parents that children don't have. And therefore, children, it's not your job to negotiate with your parents, to try to figure out, submit to them when you agree with them. No, you're called to obey, to listen and act, recognizing that God has put them in authority. Now, what that means is that you look at that and you assume, okay, I'm going to assume you're right. But even if not, what does it say? Obey because it pleases the Lord. And this is vital. Because when you realize as a child, why do you obey? Because God has placed your parents in a position of authority. You obey as is to the Lord. You see, when you are not obeying your parents, you're ultimately rebelling against God. See, it's a question of obeying, not only obeying, but as we talked even a little bit, a couple weeks ago, respecting and honoring. It's an attitude issue, not just a behavioral issue. But we're to obey as to the Lord. Why? Because what we recognize is that God has put them in authority. And what does he say? Obey in everything. It doesn't mean obey if you agree with them. I know some parents, I obey, but I disagree this time. Or children will say that. You're not obeying if you just obey when you agree. Your obedience isn't evident until you disagree. It says everything in the Word. If your parents tell you to do something that goes against the Bible, if they tell you to sin, well, then you don't obey them in that because you always obeyed God first. But in everything, if they don't tell you to sin, in everything else, what you do is you go, and as you get older, you might voice your concerns, voice your opinions, but once your parents make a final decision, you obey it. And the key is it's not because your parents are right all the time. It's not, because your parents won't be right all the time. But he doesn't say obey if they're right, or obey if you agree with them, or obey. No, he says obey as to the Lord. Why? Because ultimately you've got to recognize that your parents will answer to God for the decisions they make, and you will answer to God for how you obey them. And you obey them because God has given them that authority. And you recognize that position of authority and the dignity that they put under that by obeying them, even if you think that they're wrong, even if you think they don't get it, if they're mistaken. And when you don't, you're disobeying God. Now let's go back to verse 21, and he comes back to now parents. And he gives guidelines to us as parents. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged. And what he teaches us is even as we discipline, there are right ways and there are wrong ways to discipline. There are things that we should see in this that are the right way to approach it, and there are some things that can be harmful. Now, some people will talk about, when you talk about discipline and punishment, and when it talks about, don't spare the rod, and people say, well, we shouldn't do that because, if we discipline, it can become abusive or it can become negative. what we need to realize is that the answer to improper discipline is not no discipline, but it's godly discipline. So we need to understand where the excesses are, where it could be wrong, but then how do we do it right? See, our goal should always be discipline, not punishment. There's a difference between discipline and punishment. Punishment can be used as a tool in discipline, but it is different. See, punishment is consequence. Punishment is you've done something and there's a consequence, and here's the result of what you've done. When our children are younger, a lot of those consequences should be artificial. They do something, if you disobey, well, I'm going to give you this artificial consequence, time out, a spanking, whatever it would be. You see, as they get older, then there are consequences that will happen in real life, natural consequences. And part of what we try to do is we try to say that there's consequence in behavior. And it's consequence that should be appropriate to the offense and appropriate to the age of our children. Proverbs 13, he who spares the rod hates his son, but whoever loves him is careful to discipline him. See, we will, as a loving act, allow consequence. We will allow punishment as a teaching tool. See, but punishment is not the goal. It's a tool toward discipline. It's consequence with the goal of discipline is about teaching. There's a book that was out a number of years ago, and it's been a bestseller for a number of years, Ross Campbell. And he describes, let me share a quote that he says about the difference here. He says, anyone can beat a child with a rod as a primary way of controlling his behavior. That takes no sensitivity, no judgment, no understanding, and no talent. To depend on corporal punishment as the principal means of method of discipline is to make the critical error in assuming that discipline equals punishment. Discipline is training the child in the way that he should go. Punishment is only one part of this, and the less the better. Please remember this statement: the better disciplined a child is, the less punishment will be required. How well a child responds to discipline depends primarily on how much the child feels loved and accepted. So there are times that we look at this and we say there is punishment. Now, what is the basic principle? The great thing to remember is, the hot stove principle. You just, you say there's a hot stove, if you touch it, you're going to be burnt. There's a consequence. I give you a warning. If you do that, you're going to be burnt. Now, that's true in a hot stove, but it should be true of every area. That's what we do with discipline. We say, here's an action. We want to tell you, if you touch this, if you do this, if you disobey me, you're going to get burnt. And here's the way that you're going to get burnt. Here's the consequence. And then if you do that, there will be some degree of punishment, some consequence, but the goal is always teaching. And then when we've taught them, there might be some times that you have to persevere in that punishment because they've not learned it, so you persevere. But when they've learned it, then you always restore. Then you always come back and you forgive them and you restore them and you love them. And I always remember a story with this with our one son, David. And he had done something. He was just very young, and he had done something, and it was one of those battles of the will that you have with your children. And so he had done something, and we gave him time out and said, okay, David, now when you say that you're sorry, then you can come out of timeout. You got to tell us what you did. So you'd say, I'm sorry. No, what did you do? You got to tell us what you did wrong and say you're sorry and ask for forgiveness. You can come out. Now we go in 5 minutes later. David, are you willing to say no? We go in like every 5 or 10 minutes, and you say, are you waiting? Going, no. Well, you have to stand. He throw another fit, and this went on again. Now he was maybe 4 years old, and this went on for like 2 hours. Now with a 4-year-old, that's forever. And you're sitting there thinking, am I punishing him? Am I just wrong? And no, because there's an issue of the heart. I know he can learn it. I know he can acknowledge what he is doing, but it's a battle of the will, and he's saying, who's going to give in first? And finally, after like 2 hours, they finally come in and said, I said, David, are you willing to admit you're wrong? You can come out when you admit that you're wrong and ask that you're sorry. And finally he says, I'm wrong. And so I give him a hug and kiss him and talk about it a little bit more. Now what I love is the very next day, he had done something wrong. The very next day, I look at him and he did something very similar he'd done the previous day before. And I look at him and I said, David, what did you do? And you could tell in his mind, he started to get a defense, and then he remembered everything that happened, and suddenly he got this giant smile, and he said, I did it! And he came and he gave me a hug. And it was like, let's go beyond all that, let's just get to the restoration. And I love that. Because that's what our kids need to know, is that they need to know there will be consequence, but there's always restoration. Because it's about teaching. It's about teaching and mentoring their heart. Now, when he says when we do this, we've got to be careful. And what does he say? Look at it again in verse 20. What's the warning? In 21. Do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. And he gives us a warning against provoking, or another translation we have, aggravating our children. It could be embittering our children. The New Living Translation reads, fathers, do not aggravate your children. If you do, they'll get discouraged and quit trying. The Message reads, parents, don't come down too hard on your children or you'll crush their spirits. You think of the idea of breaking a horse. You can have an incredibly great horse and you can come and you can be strong with it and you can break that horse. You can come and take a 2x4 and knock the horse every time that it reacts, and you're going to get a broken horse that has no energy, that has no spirit. That's not what you want. What you want to do is you want, in a sense, to break its rebellion in a sense, but keep its spirit, so it's obedient without being truly broken. See, what we need to remember is that the goal of discipline is always shaping the heart, not just the behavior. And it's easier to focus just on the behavior. That's where we often can provoke or aggravate our children. We sit there and it's just about the behavior, and we're trying to do this, and we're trying to make sure that they do this. And a lot of times they do something wrong, and they didn't necessarily mean to, but because we want them to look good, we correct them. Or we continue to put this pressure on them. So let me take just a few ideas real quickly. What are some ways that we can do this? What are ways that we can embitter or discourage our children? Let me give you 3 ideas real quick. One is that we can discipline out of anger. So, one thing that happens is when our children, act in a way that frustrates us, what we do is we respond out of anger, or out of frustration. But our anger and our frustration should never be the cause of discipline. It shouldn't be because they got me mad. It should be because they disobeyed. And if you become angry, here's what I want to encourage you to do. If you're angry and you're going to respond out of anger, walk away. Especially as our kids get a little older, walk away and say, well, what you did is wrong, and I'm going to tell you tomorrow what the consequence is. What tends to happen? We get angry and we say, well, this is this, and you're going to be grounded for the rest of your life, and we yell at them, and then we go to bed at night and we're like, oh man, I overreacted, I feel really guilty, and we stay up all night worrying about what we said and how to get out of it, right? See, it's a whole lot better that we get frustrated and angry and we say, what you did is really wrong, I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. And now they stay up all night worrying about what's going to happen tomorrow morning, and you can go to bed and you can sleep. I mean, that's a much better way to do that. Don't discipline out of anger. And we don't do anything because there are times that our kids will embarrass us, or, it's always a matter of the heart. I mean, I can always, things that, again, I can pick on David a little bit. I still remember one of the embarrassing moments with David is we talk about VBS. I said we're pretty new at our church down in Greenville. And he's just a little 2, 3-year-old, and we had VBS, and we had a lunch at the end of the VBS, and we had a visiting family there, and I'm talking to the visiting family, and David, you go around and you've got little kids, and when they look at the parents, they just see like shorts and up, they don't necessarily see. So David's looking for mom, and he sees me sitting there talking to this woman, and just realizes that, that must be mom I'm talking to, so he goes to grab her hand, but misses her hand, and puts his hand right up her shorts. And she's, whoa, and it's like, whoa, whose child is this? And, now I'm really tempted to totally disown him or to get mad at him, and because he embarrassed me. Do I discipline him for that? No. Because even though it might have caused me embarrassment or anger, that's not an issue of discipline. The second thing we can do is we can be inconsistent in our discipline. The Bible's really clear about what's right and wrong. The 10 Commandments don't change. Again, what we need is hot stove principle. Here's what's right, here's what's wrong, here's what's going to happen. You know what happened? Think about what it would be like if, in our experience, that we had unclarity in what's right and wrong. I mean, think about it if you're, driving down 77 after church, and as you're going down 77, there's a speed limit 55 miles an hour, and then you come to one 65, and then you come to another, it's 25, and then you come to one that's 40. And you're like, every mile there's a different speed limit. And you're like, what in the world is this? And then you don't see one for a while, and you're driving down, and you're not sure, 50 miles an hour, and you hear a siren behind you. And he says, you know how fast you're going? And he says, I'm not really sure, the speed limits are all different here. And he says, well, the speed limit here is 15 miles an hour. I'm like, I didn't see a sign with that. Well, it is. It's 15 miles an hour. And your punishment is you've got 4 years in jail. You're like, oh, what are you kidding? He says, well, that's just what I feel like today. I'm just in a bad mood. So today the punishment is 4 years in jail. Now, how would you feel about that? I mean, yeah, that's, as crazy as that sounds, that's what we can do with our children. We sit there and, well, here's a rule and here's a rule, and depending on how we feel, and it's always changing, and the consequences are depending. Sometimes you totally get away with it, we ignore it, we just, sometimes you do it, and boy, that time we just snap, and we come down on hard for the same thing that we allowed them to do yesterday. And we need to realize that, no, the Bible is very clear, and the Bible calls us to be clear about what's right and wrong and consequences, and if we don't, we embitter them, we discourage them. The third thing we can do is we can become overly harsh and critical. That what we can do is we can fixate on the discipline and their failures. And so that we sit there and we constantly beat them up, constantly criticize. Why do you fail? And we speak to them in such a way that we almost assume their failure. And or even after we've learned the lesson, we continue to come back to it. We continue to repeat it. So their heart's there, but we just have to keep reminding them. And they can frustrate, it can embitter. But on the other hand, what does it say? Don't discourage. And if we don't discourage, what is he calling us to do? He's calling us to encourage. And what can we do? See, when we look at discipline, it shouldn't be discouraging. It should be something that, when it's biblical and godly, it literally encourages. So how do we do that? A couple thoughts. Always focus on your child's heart, not just their behavior. Not only communicating the action that you want them to do, but the why. I want you to obey for this reason. Here is why this is the right thing to do. Because we're trying to raise not Pharisees who keep the law, we're trying to raise moral adults whose hearts are shaped. And if our goal is to shape their hearts, not just their behavior, then we need to spend time focusing on their positive character. We need to celebrate the positive things they do. Someone had said this. They said, if a child gets more attention from her parents for being bad than for being good, they'll be a handful. We need to spend more time celebrating the positive that they do, encouraging their good behaviors. It's something we have to be intentional. We will always notice the bad. We have to be really intentional of noticing and celebrating the good. And if that's our goal, that we need to focus on celebrating and encouraging that, and then always being intentional about communicating our love and acceptance. Not only just the praise when they do things right, but then when we discipline them and correct them, to accept them and to hug them and to tell them they're forgiven. So that when the time comes and like I think with my David, that he'll come back and he says, I did it, I want to be restored. And I know that there will be that there will be restoration and not only correction. And that we need to be consistent in our discipline. And that often means thinking through the issues. What are the main issues that your kids or your grandkids are thinking through? What is the approach that you have? Define the hot stove. Define, if you do this, this is what happens. Tell them what's going to happen. Be consistent. Be consistent between husband and wife so that there's always there's a commonality. Back each other up. Even if your spouse reacted the wrong way, back them up. Be consistent, because God has called us to this incredibly difficult challenge of parenting. And again, for many, your kids are grown. You're still in it, not only supporting your children, but now grandparents, and helping them think this through. It's hard. It's tough. But it's one of the most important things that we will ever do. And whereas they didn't come with a detailed instruction book, there are principles. When we follow these principles, they work. And our children are so important. It's worth the hard effort. It's worth the discipline of persevering and following through, of doing what we need to do to be able to invest in our kids so that we will say, as they get older, that they will be the young men and young women that we long for them to be.